The Nexus archive existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, which was precisely 16 more than most beings could comprehend and exactly 17 more than anyone actually needed. But when you're the galaxy's premier repository of knowledge, apparently you can't just settle for boring old three-dimensional space like some backwater planetary library. No, you need crystalline spires that twisted through folded space-time, reading rooms that existed in temporal loops, and checkout counters staffed by beings who'd achieved enlightenment but still insisted on charging late fees. The morning shift, if you could call it morning when dealing with a facility that operated on universal standard time while existing partially outside of time itself, brought the usual parade of intellectual peacocking. The Vorthak delegation glided through the main hall with their characteristic air of superiority, their elongated skulls practically gleaming with smugness. They'd been the galaxy's designated smart guys for about 3 millennia now, ever since they'd figured out how to harness dark matter for their morning coffee. Never mind that half their discoveries came from accidentally misreading instruction manuals. The galaxy had collectively decided that if you looked sufficiently pretentious and spoke in unnecessarily complex sentence structures, you must be brilliant. Behind them shuffled the Cognari, tentacles writhing in what passed for excited academic discussion among their species. They'd built their entire civilization around the concept of peer review, which meant every conversation required a minimum of 4 citations and a lengthy bibliography. Watching them try to order lunch was an exercise in bureaucratic torture that could break lesser minds. The ethereal collective drifted past next, their translucent forms shimmering with what observers generously called otherworldly wisdom, but was probably just really expensive mood lighting. They communicated through harmonic resonance and had never met a simple concept they couldn't transform into a dissertation-length philosophical treatise. Ask an ethereal the time, and you'd get a 3-hour lecture on the subjective nature of temporal perception. And there, pushing a maintenance cart between these towering intellects of the cosmos, was humanity's sole representative in this temple of knowledge. Not that anyone would recognize her as such. She'd mastered the art of bureaucratic invisibility so completely that most aliens assumed she was some kind of particularly mobile furniture. Her uniform bore the designation of environmental maintenance specialist, which was corporate speak for the person who cleans up after beings too evolved to figure out trash receptacles. The irony wasn't lost on her that she possessed 3 advanced degrees from Earth universities, spoke 14 languages, and had published papers on xenolinguistics that would have revolutionized galactic communication studies if anyone had bothered to read them. But since she came from a Class 7 developing world whose greatest achievement according to the Galactic Classification Committee was achieving nuclear weapons before space travel, her academic credentials carried about as much weight as a Vorthak's sense of humor. She'd stumbled into this job through the galaxy's most Byzantine employment program, which randomly selected primitives for menial positions as part of some incomprehensible diversity initiative. The selection process involved filling out forms in 17 different languages and undergoing psychological evaluation by beings whose psychology was so alien they considered basic pattern recognition a sign of dangerous instability, and passing a physical exam that somehow required her to prove she could lift objects in negative gravity. The daily routine had become almost meditative. She'd wheel her cart through corridors that existed in impossible geometric configurations, clean reading pods designed for beings with anywhere from 2 to 47 limbs, and occasionally prevent interdimensional incidents by remembering to empty the quantum waste receptacles before they achieved critical mass. The work wasn't intellectually stimulating, but it provided an excellent vantage point for observing the galaxy's supposedly superior minds in their natural habitat. Today promised to deliver the usual entertainment. The morning brought a heated debate between a group of Zalari philosophers and some Mindbridge scholars about the proper interpretation of a text that had been written in a language extinct for 12,000 years. Neither side actually spoke the language naturally, but that hadn't stopped them from forming very strong opinions about its metaphysical implications. Near the quantum literature section, a cluster of graduate students from various species huddled around data tablets, engaging in the universal academic ritual of trying to look deeply thoughtful while secretly panicking about their dissertation. Their advisors, meanwhile, had gathered in what they called a symposium, but which functioned more like a support group for beings whose entire sense of self-worth depended on other people finding their research minimally interesting. The checkout station had developed its usual morning queue of patrons who'd somehow managed to lose books that existed in protected dimensional pockets. The head librarian, a cognitari whose tentacles had turned prematurely gray from dealing with the public, performed the daily miracle of maintaining professional courtesy, while internally screaming at beings who insisted their overdue materials had been temporarily displaced into alternate timelines. And through it all, she pushed her cart, collected discarded research notes, and listened to the greatest minds in the galaxy demonstrate that intelligence and wisdom were two entirely different things. Little did they suspect that their anonymous maintenance worker could probably solve half their research problems during a coffee break, if anyone had bothered to ask her opinion. But nobody asked maintenance workers for their thoughts on advanced xenolinguistics. That would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? The tranquility of intellectual superiority shattered at precisely 0900 Universal Standard Time, when Professor Valdris Nethkan arrived in a transport that was approximately 73. The thing materialized in the archive's main docking bay with enough dimensional flourish to power a small space station, which was typical Vorthak behavior. They couldn't simply arrive somewhere, they had to make reality itself sit up and take note. Nethkan himself embodied everything the galaxy had come to expect from celebrated Vorthak scholars, an elongated skull that seemed to house twice the standard allocation of smugness, robes that cost more than most planets' annual defense budgets, and the sort of deliberate, measured walk that suggested he was personally carrying the weight of universal knowledge. His entourage followed at a respectful distance, tablets clutched to their chests like sacred texts, whispering among themselves with the hushed reverence typically reserved for religious ceremonies or particularly explosive gossip. The academic community had gathered to witness what promised to be either groundbreaking scholarship or spectacular intellectual carnage. Nethkan had sent word ahead about his extraordinary discovery, a phrase that in academic circles typically meant either genuine brilliance or career-ending delusion, with very little middle ground between the two. The main auditorium filled with representatives from every major species, each positioning themselves according to the unspoken but ironclad hierarchy of galactic academia. The Vorthak delegation claimed the premium seating naturally, while the Cognari arranged themselves in neat rows that somehow managed to look both organized and judgmental. The ethereal collective hovered above everyone else, because even their seating arrangements had to make philosophical statements about the nature of physical existence. Our maintenance worker found herself with an unexpectedly perfect vantage point. Her cart had developed what the repair technicians called dimensional alignment issues, which was a fancy way of saying it occasionally forgot which dimension it was supposed to exist in. Rather than filling out the 17 different forms required to report the malfunction, she'd simply learned to work around it. Today, the cart's existential crisis had positioned her in a corner where she could observe the proceedings while appearing to organize cleaning supply. Nethkan approached the podium with the confidence of someone who'd spent considerable time practicing his dramatic entrances in front of mirrors. The auditorium fell silent, except for the soft humming of translation devices and the occasional whispered prayer from graduate students hoping their own research wouldn't be rendered obsolete by whatever bombshell was about to drop. Esteemed colleagues, Nethkan began, his voice carrying the sort of practiced gravitas that came from years of believing his own press releases. Today I present evidence that will fundamentally challenge our understanding of developing civilizations and their capacity for philosophical insight. The audience leaned forward collectively like flowers turning towards sunlight. Nothing got academics more excited than the possibility of having their worldviews completely upended by someone else's research. It meant they could spend the next several years writing papers either supporting or refuting whatever was about to be revealed, which was basically job security in academic form. I have discovered, Nethkan continued, pausing for maximum dramatic effect, fragments of what appears to be an advanced philosophical text from the human homeworld. A text that demonstrates levels of metaphysical sophistication previously thought impossible for a Class 7 civilization. The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a meditation aid. Somewhere in the back, a Zilari scholar's breathing apparatus made a sound suspiciously like suppressed laughter. The very idea that humans, beings who still used projectile weapons and hadn't figured out faster than light travel without help, could produce genuine philosophical insight was so absurd it bordered on comedy. But Nethkan wasn't finished. With a flourish that would have made professional entertainers jealous, he activated a holographic display that projected text fragments across the auditorium's main screen. The words appeared in standard Galactic script translated from what he claimed were ancient human languages. "Consider this passage," he announced, gesturing toward the display. Quote, The real treasure was the friends we made along the way. This demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between material acquisition and social bonding that rivals our most advanced theories on resource allocation psychology. Several scholars began taking notes frantically. The Cognari delegation had already started what appeared to be an impromptu peer review session, tentacles writhing with academic excitement. Or this profound observation, Nethkan continued, clearly warming to his subject. Quote, a remarkably concise encapsulation of existential resonance that manages to capture the universal experience of emotional recognition in merely 2 words. The philosophical density is extraordinary. The maintenance worker nearly choked on her own She recognized those phrases not as profound philosophical insights, but as the sort of casual internet slang that humans tossed around without thinking. But watching the galaxy's greatest minds treat memes as deep wisdom was so surreal she wondered if someone had slipped hallucinogens into the air recycling system. Most intriguing of all, Nethkan pressed on, completely oblivious to the cosmic joke he was perpetrating, is this cryptic statement, "This is fine." The text suggests this was inscribed during a period of significant upheaval, yet the words demonstrate an almost Zen-like acceptance of chaos. The psychological resilience implied by such philosophy indicates a species far more emotionally evolved than our current classifications suggest. By now, half the audience was scribbling notes while the other half engaged in heated whispered debates about the implication. The ethereal collective had begun humming in harmonies that suggested deep philosophical contemplation, while the Mindbridge scholars were already forming research committees to investigate these revelations further. The maintenance worker watched this intellectual circus with a mixture of horror and fascination. These beings had spent millennia developing complex theories about consciousness, society, and existence. They'd written treatises that spanned multiple volumes and required specialized degrees just to comprehend, and now they were treating random internet memes like sacred texts. But the truly terrifying part wasn't their misinterpretation, it was how seriously they were taking it. Academic reputations were being staked on theories about human philosophical sophistication based on jokes people made while procrastinating at work. And nobody, absolutely nobody, thought to ask the actual human in the room what any of it meant. The academic meltdown began approximately 37 minutes after Nethkan's presentation, which was actually a new record for galactic scholarly catastrophe. The previous record had been held by a Zalari philosopher who'd accidentally proven that mathematics didn't exist, causing a 3-day crisis that required emergency intervention from the Department of Existential Stability. The problem started when Chief Archivist Threnody, a Cognari whose 43 years of service had earned her the right to question even the most celebrated scholars, raised a tentacle with the sort of deliberate precision that suggested incoming academic carnage. Her voice when she spoke carried the weight of someone who'd spent decades watching brilliant minds make spectacular fools of themselves. "Professor Nethkan," she began, her translator struggling to convey the subtle undertones of polite skepticism that Cognari had elevated to an art form. "While your discovery is certainly fascinating, I must confess that our extensive archives contain no record of these particular human texts. Given that we maintain comprehensive documentation of all known philosophical works from developing civilizations, this presents something of a puzzle." The silence that followed was the sort typically associated with gas giants imploding. Nethkan's confident expression flickered like a malfunctioning hologram, while his entourage suddenly found their tablets extremely interesting to stare at. The audience, meanwhile, experienced the collective academic equivalent of watching a transport crash in slow motion, horrible to witness, impossible to look away from. Perhaps Nethkan managed, his voice maintaining its scholarly tone despite what sounded suspiciously like rising panic. "These texts represent recently discovered materials. Human civilization has been quite prolific in recent centuries." Threnody's tentacles performed what could only be described as a skeptical wiggle. "Our acquisition protocols include real-time monitoring of all significant cultural developments on Class 7 worlds. If texts of this philosophical caliber existed, we would have catalogued them immediately." What followed was the academic equivalent of a cascade failure. Other archivists began accessing their systems, running searches that should have immediately located any texts matching Nethkan's quotation. The results were uniformly negative, which led to the sort of frantic rechecking that occurred when supposedly foolproof systems suddenly developed a sense of humor.
The maintenance worker watched this unfold with the sort of detached fascination typically reserved for natural disasters, or particularly inventive forms of bureaucratic incompetence. She could have resolved the entire crisis with a 30-second explanation, but nobody had asked her opinion. Besides, there was something almost therapeutic about watching beings who considered themselves intellectual giants discover they'd been outsmarted by internet culture. The situation deteriorated further when additional scholars began demanding to examine Nethkan's source material. Unfortunately, as he was forced to admit with increasing desperation, he'd obtained the fragments through intermediary channels that were now proving mysteriously difficult to verify. The academic equivalent of claiming your research had been eaten by interdimensional space dogs. "This is unprecedented," muttered Dr. Quillian Vex, a Mindbridge researcher, whose specialty in xenolinguistics should have made him ideally qualified to resolve the crisis. Instead, he found himself staring at text fragments that appeared to exist in some sort of academic limbo, clearly meaningful, obviously significant, but utterly untraceable. The maintenance worker had to admire the cosmic irony. Here were beings who could calculate the orbital mechanics of 17-dimensional space stations, decode languages that had been extinct for millennia, and write theoretical frameworks that explained the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Yet they were completely stumped by casual human internet slang that any 12-year-old back on Earth could have explained in less time than it took to order pizza. The crisis reached critical mass when archivist Threnody made the announcement that would haunt galactic academia for years to come. "We cannot locate these texts in any known human cultural database. The philosophical concepts referenced by Professor Nethkan appear to exist nowhere in our comprehensive records of human intellectual development." The implications hit the assembled scholars like a meteor strike. Either Nethkan had fabricated the entire presentation career suicide in academic circles, or humanity had somehow produced philosophical insights so profound that they'd transcended normal methods of cultural transmission. Neither option was particularly comforting. It was at this moment of maximum intellectual chaos that someone finally noticed the human pushing a maintenance cart in the corner. The observation came from Dr. Yelara Fenwick, an ethereal whose translucent form had been shimmering with increasingly agitated harmonics as the crisis deepened. Her realization rippled through the collective consciousness of her species, before being translated into audible speech. "There is," she announced, her voice carrying the sort of ethereal wisdom that made even simple observations sound like cosmic revelations, "a representative of the species in question present among us. Every head, tentacle, optical organ, and consciousness focus in the auditorium turned toward the maintenance worker with the synchronized precision of a military parade. She suddenly found herself the center of attention in a way that was roughly equivalent to being caught in the blast radius of an exploding star. The silence stretched for what felt like geological epoch. Then Threnody, with the desperate air of someone willing to grasp at any available solution, raised a tentacle in what passed for polite inquiry among her species. "Excuse me," she said, her translator working overtime to convey the appropriate mixture of scholarly desperation and bureaucratic courtesy. "You are human, correct?" The maintenance worker paused in her inventory of cleaning supplies, looked up at the assembled intellectual elite of the galaxy, and delivered what would later be remembered as one of the most understated responses in academic history. "Yeah, that's generally how the species classification works. Would you," Threnody continued, her tentacles performing complex patterns that suggested she was experiencing something between hope and existential crisis, "be familiar with the philosophical texts Professor Nethkan has referenced?" The maintenance worker glanced at the holographic display still showing the mysterious quotations, then back at the expectant faces of the galaxy's greatest minds. A slow smile spread across her features, the sort of expression that suggested someone was about to watch their entire worldview get rearranged by forces they hadn't seen coming. "Oh," she said, setting down her cleaning supplies with deliberate care, "you mean the meme?" The word memes hit the assembled galactic intelligentsia with roughly the same impact as announcing that the universe had decided to run backwards for a while just to see what would happen. The translation systems, apparently unprepared for this particular linguistic curveball, began emitting sounds that ranged from confused bleeping to what might generously be called electronic sobbing. Professor Nethkan's face went through a color spectrum that would have fascinated xenobiologists if any of them had been paying attention to anything other than the rapidly approaching academic apocalypse. "Me," he repeated, his voice carrying the sort of strangled quality typically associated with beings who just realized they'd built their entire reputation on a foundation of cosmic misunderstanding. The maintenance worker, who was rapidly discovering that being the center of galactic attention was significantly less entertaining than observing from the sidelines, nodded with the patient air of someone about to explain basic concepts to very confused children. Internet meme, jokes, casual observations, things people share when they're bored at work or procrastinating on their actual responsibilities. The silence that followed could have been used to calibrate deep space listening equipment. Somewhere in the back of the auditorium, a graduate student's breathing apparatus made a sound suspiciously like hysteria being forcibly suppressed. "Let me break this down for you," she continued, gesturing toward the holographic display with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent years watching brilliant beings make elementary mistakes. "The real treasure was the friends we made along the way. That's from Adventure Story. It's what characters say when they realize the journey was more important than whatever they were originally looking for. People use it ironically now, usually when something turns out to be completely pointless." ArchivistsTurnedtoHerfor's tentacles had begun performing what could only be described as the dance of existential crisis. But the philosophical implications, the sophisticated understanding of social bonding versus material acquisition. It's a joke about how most quests in entertainment are basically elaborate friendship exercises, with better special effects, the maintenance worker interrupted, not unkindly. People started using it to mock situations where the supposed reward was obviously less valuable than the experience of getting there. The MindBridge researchers had begun what appeared to be an emergency consultation session, their telepathic capabilities working overtime to process this new information. Dr. Vex looked like someone who'd just discovered that his life's work was based on a particularly elaborate prank. "And Big Mood," Nethkhan managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "means I relate to that, or that's exactly how I feel, usually about mundane stuff like being tired or wanting pizza. Sometimes people say it about more abstract concepts, but it's still just casual agreement. There's no deep existential resonance involved. It's basically the verbal equivalent of nodding." The ethereal collective had stopped humming entirely, which was roughly equivalent to a small star going out. Their translucent forms flickered with what observers might have mistaken for deep contemplation, but was probably just the philosophical equivalent of system overload. "This is fine," she continued, warming to her subject as she watched the galaxy's intellectual elite grapple with the destruction of their carefully constructed theories. "That's from a webcomic. A cartoon dog sitting in a burning room, drinking coffee, saying everything's fine when it obviously isn't. People use it when situations are clearly terrible, but they're trying to maintain some semblance of composure. It's about denial, not Zen accept." The academic carnage was reaching levels that would require intervention from the Department of Intellectual Disaster Relief. Several scholars had begun what appeared to be the early stages of nervous breakdowns, while others were frantically accessing databases to verify that their own research wasn't built on similar misunderstanding. "So you're telling us," Turnedtohe said, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose worldview had just been demolished by casual conversation, "that we've spent the morning analyzing jokes?" "Pretty much, yeah." The maintenance worker shrugged with the sort of casual gesture that had probably never been performed in the Nexus Archive's main auditorium before. "Though to be fair, some of our jokes are actually pretty philosophical when you think about them. We just don't usually present them as formal academic theories." What happened next would be studied by sociologists, psychologists, and historians for decades. The galaxy's premier academic institution experienced what could only be described as a collective cognitive recalibration. Beings who'd spent their entire careers analyzing the deep meanings behind obscure texts suddenly found themselves questioning whether they'd understood anything at all. But rather than admit defeat, because academic pride is apparently a universal constant that transcends species barriers, they did what academics have always done when confronted with uncomfortable truths. They adapted the narrative to preserve their expertise. Within hours, the Nexus Archive had established the Department of Human Cultural Interpretation, with our former maintenance worker installed as its inaugural director. Her official title became Senior Consultant for Advanced Human Humor Theory, because apparently the galaxy's intellectual elite couldn't simply admit they'd been outsmarted by internet culture. The department's first official publication was a comprehensive guide to the philosophical implications of Earth-based memetic communication, which somehow managed to transform casual internet slang into a sophisticated theoretical framework for understanding human consciousness. Graduate students began writing dissertations on the existential significance of cat videos and the metaphysical structure of reaction GIFs. Professor Neth Khan, rather than face academic disgrace, reinvented himself as a specialist in cross-species humor translation. His follow-up paper, The Cognitive Dissonance Theory of Human Ironic Expression, became required reading in xenolinguistics programs across 17 sectors. The truly remarkable part was how quickly the Galactic academic community convinced itself that this had all been part of a sophisticated intellectual exercise. Within months, universities throughout the galaxy were offering courses in applied human memetics, treating the study of internet jokes as a legitimate field of scholarly inquiry. The maintenance worker, now director of a department she'd never asked for, found herself in the peculiar position of explaining to the galaxy's brightest minds that humans routinely created profound philosophical statements without realizing it, usually while procrastinating or making fun of things they found annoying. Her office, which existed in at least 3 dimensions more than strictly necessary, became a pilgrimage site for scholars seeking to understand how a species could accidentally achieve enlightenment through casual sarcasm. The galaxy had gained a new respect for human intellectual capacity, even if that respect was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what humans were actually doing. Earth's cultural exports were suddenly treated as sophisticated philosophical treatises, which meant that somewhere in the universe, alien graduate students were probably writing thesis papers on the deeper meaning of cat meme. And in the end, perhaps that was the most human joke of all, a species that had stumbled into cosmic intellectual recognition, not through deliberate wisdom, but by being so casually profound that the rest of the galaxy couldn't tell the difference between their jokes and their philosophy. The maintenance cart, meanwhile, finally got its dimension alignment issues fixed. Nobody had bothered to ask if that's what it had wanted all along, but that would have been ridiculous, wouldn't it?